For decades, we've been told the same story. The pyramids of Egypt were tombs, final resting places for pharaohs. Sounds reasonable at first. But here's what we actually know. After roughly 200 years of archaeological research, not a single mummy has been found inside the Giza pyramids. No gold, no inscriptions that clearly point to burials. So how does that make sense? Look at the Valley of the Kings. Everything there is clearly about the afterlife. Walls covered in hieroglyphs, scenes of the journey beyond death, sarcophagi, human remains. But no pyramids. Now flip it. At Giza, you've got the pyramids, but none of those burial traces. So let's take a fresh look at the Giza Plateau. There's the version that's been around for 200 years, built on archaeology and widely accepted, and then there's another one. The second version comes from engineers and scientists, and it raises questions the first version can't fully answer. Today, we're diving into both. But if the pyramid isn't a tomb, then what is it? The Great Pyramid is the largest of them all. It basically defines the whole site. Originally, it stood around 480 feet tall, 146 meters. For nearly 4,000 years, nothing on Earth surpassed it. During Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, French engineers ran the numbers. If you took it apart and built a wall 10 feet high, it could wrap around all of France. But the real question isn't how big it is, it's why something this complex was ever needed in the first place. The Pyramid of Khafre stands a bit farther back. At first glance, it looks taller. It isn't. That's just an illusion. It sits on higher ground. In a way, it feels like it's adjusting to the first pyramid, not competing with it, but fitting into a larger layout, like a component in a system with a specific role to play. Then there's the Pyramid of Menkaure, noticeably smaller, almost half the height. Next to the first two, it feels almost secondary. But here's the paradox. Inside, it's more complex. The internal layout is more intricate, and the lower section is faced with massive blocks of red granite, still intact today. So if these are just tombs, why is the smallest one reinforced with the strongest material and built with the most complicated internal structure? That's where the logic starts to fall apart. Compare this to other major ancient builds. The Colosseum was designed as an arena, and everything inside serves that purpose. Seating tiers, the central floor, underground passages for animals. The Parthenon was built as a temple, and every detail reflects that. But when you look inside the Great Pyramid, narrow shafts, sealed chambers, sloped passageways at precise angles, you don't see anything that clearly fits a burial. What you do see looks more like some kind of system. One pyramid, the largest, dominates. The second, set higher, supports the overall geometry. The third, smaller but more complex inside, reinforced with granite. This doesn't look like three independent projects. It looks like a system, one where each part complements the others. Look closer at the differences: size, angles, materials. They're not random.
They vary exactly where variation would make sense if this were a unified design, not three rulers competing for glory. Something else entirely. Why build something this precise, this massive, this complex for a single purpose like burial? There's still no clear answer, but a new idea starts to take shape. What if we've been misunderstanding these structures from the very beginning? And the real shock isn't how they were built, but who was the first to look at them in a completely different way. In the mid-20th century, someone from a completely different field took an interest in Giza. His name was Edward Kunkel. He was a mechanical engineer by training. Most of his career focused on pump systems and the movement of fluids under pressure. His mindset wasn't tuned to rituals or symbolism. It was tuned to pressure, flow, and how systems actually work. The first time he stepped inside the Great Pyramid, he didn't see what others saw. Where archaeologists saw corridors guiding the soul to the afterlife, Kunkel saw narrow channels with precise geometry. Where others described burial chambers, he saw enclosed spaces, more like sealed cavities designed to handle air and pressure. So here's the question. Why would someone who spent his life designing hydraulic systems instantly recognize something familiar inside the pyramid? In 1962, Kunkel published a paper called The Pharaoh's Pump. His idea was that the Great Pyramid could function like a hydraulic ram. Sounds complicated, but the concept is actually simple. It's a device that uses the energy of moving water to lift some of that water to a higher level. No electricity, no complex machinery, just pressure timed correctly. Think of it like a swing. You push at the right moment and the system keeps going on its own. If you break it down, water enters from below, accelerates, then suddenly stops. That pressure shock forces part of the water upward through other channels. Internal chambers absorb the spikes. Sloped passages guide the flow. The result isn't a tomb, it's a system where water is constantly moving, generating pulses. Kunkel proposed several practical uses. He believed a structure like this could have lifted water onto the plateau, irrigated nearby land, or supported construction itself. And this wasn't just a loose theory. In 1959, he patented a hydraulic design inspired by the pyramid's internal layout. The engineering behind it was solid. Still, the academic world barely reacted. The idea was simple. The pyramid stands in a dry environment, so there couldn't have been water. End of discussion. Even though, at the time, there was already evidence that the Nile's level had been significantly higher in the past and that aquifers might exist beneath the plateau. Those points were largely ignored. And this is where it starts to feel like more than just competing theories. It's two completely different ways of thinking. On one side, a historical interpretation focused on symbols and rituals. On the other, an engineering approach focused on function and system behavior. Which one is right? Still an open question. But one detail makes this story especially compelling. Kunkel's idea could have stayed a hypothesis if decades later someone hadn't decided to test it, not on paper, with their own hands. Enter John Cadman, a hydraulic engineer specializing in systems where pressure, flow, and precision are everything. His approach was straightforward. If there's a working principle inside the pyramid, it should be reproducible. So he built a model, not a rough sketch, a physical structure. Every element replicated the pyramid's internal geometry, just scaled down. Concrete, steel, exact angles, defined volumes, as close to the original as possible. It took years. The first attempt didn't work. The second didn't either. The third failed again. Water moved through the system, but it behaved like ordinary flow, no special effect, no self-sustaining motion. Instead of giving up, Cadman started tearing the model apart and comparing it to the original design. Each time he found the same thing, tiny deviations that seemed insignificant, a slightly altered angle here, a simplified shape there, a small missing protrusion somewhere else. And those small details turned out to be critical. The system didn't tolerate even the slightest inaccuracy. A deviation of just a few millimeters and it stopped working. So here's the uncomfortable question. If this really is just a tomb, why refine the geometry to a level where even a tiny error completely changes how the system behaves? The breakthrough came when Cadman stopped treating it like a standard plumbing system. This wasn't just about flow, it was about rhythm. Repeating pressure pulses that build, reflect, and amplify each other. Like a wave returning at just the right moment, adding force to the next push. Like a heartbeat, not random movement, but a controlled cycle. Once he accounted for that and replicated every element precisely, the system finally worked. Water began moving in a defined cycle. At regular intervals, powerful pressure pulses formed, and the process continued without constant external input. According to Cadman, the system entered a self-sustaining mode. He published these results on his own website. They weren't peer-reviewed, but the experimental logic is hard to ignore. If a modern model only works when the pyramid's geometry is replicated with precision, can that geometry really be accidental? Cadman found that the system didn't run continuously, it pulsed. This wasn't steady flow like a pipeline, it was closer to a heartbeat or breathing, a rhythmic process with clear cycles. And that's exactly what he reproduced. When everything was calibrated correctly, the pulses emerged on their own, no external forcing needed. And now we hit the most uncomfortable question of all. If a modern engineering model only works when the pyramid's geometry is copied exactly, what does that say about the people who created that geometry? Coincidence or precise calculation? The official explanation offers a simple answer. In ancient times, water was used to transport stone blocks. That's it. But in Cadman's experiment, water behaves differently. It becomes an energy source, something that starts and sustains the entire system. And that changes how the pyramid looks. It no longer feels like a passive structure. It starts to resemble a device, something designed to work with flow and pressure. But to be fair, this theory does run into a serious problem. If there really was a hydraulic system inside, it would have required a strong, stable water source. And today, all you see around the pyramids is desert. That's the main argument against it. So let's see how well that argument actually holds up. We're used to looking at Giza the way it looks today, but it hasn't always been like this. In 2022, a team of researchers analyzed soil samples near the plateau. They drilled deep cores and studied layers formed thousands of years ago, right around the time the pyramids were built. What they found was striking. Large amounts of pollen from plants that only grow in consistently wet environments. Papyrus, sedge, other species typical of riverbanks and marshlands. This wasn't a one-off discovery. It showed up consistently across samples. The conclusion is pretty obvious. Back then, there was a substantial body of water right next to the plateau. Not somewhere in the distance, right at its base. This ancient branch of the Nile even has a name now, the Khufu branch. It was large enough to maintain a stable water level over long periods of time. American archaeologist Mark Lenner spent years excavating at the foot of the plateau. He uncovered evidence of an ancient harbor and a network of canals, and they ran almost directly up to the pyramids. This isn't about water on the horizon. It's about a built water infrastructure right at the base of the complex. Suddenly, the familiar image of pyramids in the middle of a dry desert starts to fall apart.
There's another detail people tend to overlook. Everyone knows the Nile flooded every year, but fewer people think about what that actually means. During peak flooding, water levels could rise by several meters. That means every year, predictable, cyclical, a powerful surge of water reached the base of the plateau. And that kind of rhythmic, repeating input, that's exactly what a pulse-based system would need. Coincidence? Or is that why the pyramids were built here in the first place? In 2013, archaeologists discovered ancient papyri at Wadi al-Jarf, about 4,500 years old, the oldest known papyrus texts to date. They turned out to be work logs written by an overseer named Merer. He carefully recorded deliveries of construction materials to the building site and specifically noted water routes. So now we know how the materials were transported. But we still don't know why the pyramids were built the way they were.
Geological studies suggest that during the construction period, parts of the Giza Plateau may have been partially flooded during seasonal inundations. For a simple tomb, that's a problem. For a system designed to work with flow and pressure, it's a resource. Scientists have long identified a period known as the African Humid Period. During that time, the climate across what is now the Sahara was completely different. Not desert, but green landscapes, rivers, lakes, and dense vegetation. Essentially a savanna with a developed water system. If there was enough water to sustain that kind of ecosystem, could some of it have been used for engineering purposes? Back in the 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch proposed a controversial but intriguing idea. He pointed to deep vertical grooves on the surface of the Great Sphinx of Giza and the walls of the trench surrounding it. According to him, that kind of erosion isn't caused by wind, which typically leaves horizontal marks, but by prolonged, heavy rainfall. Most Egyptologists rejected the idea, but the geological argument itself was never fully disproven. And this is where the contradiction becomes hard to ignore. Mainstream archaeology says the pyramids were built around 2500 BC, at a time when Egypt was already becoming arid. But the erosion patterns on the Sphinx point to heavy rains that weren't supposed to exist in that period. So one of two things must be true. Either the Sphinx is much older than we think, or our understanding of the climate back then is incomplete. Either way, it raises serious questions about the official timeline.
There are really only two possibilities. These structures are either older than we believe, or they existed through a time when the climate was completely different. Redating the Sphinx is a massive rabbit hole for another video. Let me know in the comments if you're interested.
But for right now, we only need to take away one fact. There was water here, and not just a little, enough to create powerful, sustained flows. So now connect the dots. There's a water source. There's complex geometry sensitive to pressure. There's a working model that only functions when that geometry is replicated precisely. What if this wasn't just a local system inside a single pyramid? What if the flow was prepared and amplified before it ever entered the structure? If water flow really played a key role, it couldn't just appear out of nowhere inside the structure. It had to be collected, directed, and prepared first. Which raises the obvious question, where did that happen? Some researchers have pointed to sites a few kilometers away from Giza. At first glance, they look like unfinished or oddly shaped structures, things that don't quite fit the standard narrative. But if you look at them through an engineering lens, a different kind of logic starts to emerge. Just a few kilometers south of the plateau lies Zawit el Aryan. It's usually described as an unfinished pyramid, but its form and internal structure raise questions. At the center is a deep vertical shaft dropping roughly 20 meters down. A wide sloping passage leads into it and gradually narrows as it goes. From a burial standpoint, That narrowing doesn't make much sense. It's completely impractical for a burial. But from a fluid dynamics perspective, it's a familiar principle. When a flow passes through a narrower space, its velocity increases. Slightly pinch a hose and the stream shoots out faster. That passage may not have just guided water. It could have accelerated it before it dropped into the shaft. At the bottom, the shaft is lined with massive granite blocks, one of the hardest materials the ancient Egyptians used. Why use granite in a place that, according to the official version, didn't serve a critical function? But if high-speed water was crashing down into that space, granite make perfect sense as protection against erosion. During excavations in the early 20th century, after a heavy rain, the shaft quickly filled with water. Then, just as quickly, it drained. Not slowly, like normal absorption, but with noticeable movement. At the time, it was noted as a curious anomaly. No real conclusions were drawn. But if you look at it as part of a system, the picture starts to shift. Now, move north of Giza to Abu Rawash. Today, it looks little more than a ruined foundation. But compare it to the southern site, and something interesting appears. It almost mirrors it. A similar layout, a deep central section, a sloped descent, and most importantly, a difference in elevation. Between this site and the Giza Plateau, there's a drop of several dozen meters. Water moving along that path would naturally gain energy from gravity.
Think about it like this. If you needed to channel a powerful flow of water to a specific point and keep pressure stable, you'd place your structures in exactly this kind of arrangement. One higher to create a gradient, one lower to accelerate the flow, and a central receiver where all that energy converges. To the south, a zone where flow is accelerated and directed downward. To the north, a zone where elevation differences help build pressure. In the center, the Giza Plateau, where the pyramids stand. There's another detail worth noting. The space between these sites isn't cluttered with random structures, despite the fact that this was an area of intense construction. It's almost as if the space between them was intentionally left open. That alone is unusual. If these were just separate projects built by different rulers, why this kind of spatial alignment? Some researchers describe it as a corridor, a continuous line where each element serves a purpose. If that's the case, then we're not looking at a local mechanism. We're looking at a system stretched across tens of kilometers. And in that scenario, the pyramids themselves might not be the starting point of the process, but the final stage. Which leads to the next question. If all of this wasn't just about moving water, what was the energy of that system actually used for? If this entire system could generate pressure and store the energy of flowing water, what happened next? Just moving water through a complex setup doesn't make much sense. That's a lot of effort for a pretty basic result. So there has to be something more. This is where another engineering perspective comes in. Its author is Christopher Dunn, a specialist with years of experience in the aerospace industry, someone used to working with tight tolerances and complex systems where even the smallest mistake is critical. In 1998, he published The Giza Power Plant.
Dunn's core idea is this: the pyramid was designed as an energy conversion system. Every element, from the shape of the chambers to the choice of materials, served a specific function. But when he studied the structure, what caught his attention wasn't water flow, it was how the structure itself behaved. The Giza Plateau isn't just a place where pyramids sit. It's a massive limestone foundation, and limestone transmits vibrations well. If powerful pressure pulses travel through that base, it doesn't just absorb them, it carries them. The entire bedrock starts acting as part of the system. Water creates pulses. Those pulses travel through the foundation. The pyramid responds to them, almost like it's picking up a rhythm. At that point, we're no longer talking about basic hydraulics. This starts to look more like a tuned instrument, where not just force, but frequency matters. When you apply force at the right frequency, a structure can amplify vibrations. That's resonance. Same principle as in music. One string can make another vibrate, even if you never touched it. Or think of soldiers marching in step across a bridge. The force doesn't increase, but the frequency lines up, and suddenly the bridge starts to sway. If the pyramid was tuned to specific frequencies, it wouldn't just receive energy from water, it could amplify it. And this is where things get really interesting. Inside the pyramid, certain areas aren't made of limestone at all, but granite, a denser material rich in quartz. And quartz has a property you interact with all the time. Press the button on a kitchen lighter, you get a spark. That's the piezoelectric effect. Mechanical pressure turns into an electric charge. No battery, no chemistry, just compressing a crystal. It's the same principle used in sensors, microphones, and quartz watches today.
Now, look at the material choices. Limestone is used where you need mass and vibration transfer. Granite is used where you need a response to that vibration. That's not random. If you're just building a tomb, you don't carefully separate materials based on functional roles. And those granite blocks aren't scattered randomly either. They're concentrated in specific areas, most notably in the so-called King's Chamber. But if you stop looking at it as a burial room and start looking at it as an engineered space, it feels more like a resonator. Think of the body of a guitar. It amplifies the sound of the strings, not by adding energy, but by directing it correctly. Or think of a combustion chamber in an engine, a confined space where energy isn't lost, but concentrated. That matters because the piezoelectric effect only works under mechanical stress. So here's the simple question. Why would ancient builders haul massive granite blocks, the hardest material to work with and transport, into the very core of the structure? If not to make it respond to vibration, then why? A static quartz crystal does nothing. It needs movement, compression, vibration. Which means for that granite to activate, you first need those pulses coming from water, from resonance, from rhythmic pressure waves moving through the entire structure. One process triggers the next. Everything connects. So what happens if massive granite blocks are constantly exposed to rhythmic vibrations? The answer is pretty straightforward. They start to respond and generate an electrical effect. The chain of logic holds together. Water creates pulses. The plateau transmits vibration. The pyramid amplifies it. Granite responds, converting mechanical stress into electrical effects. At that point, the pyramid stops looking like architecture. It starts to feel less like a building and more like a machine. Which leads to the next question. If energy was being generated, where did it go? Any system that produces something needs an output. And this is where attention shifts for the first time, to the very top. The apex of the pyramid isn't decorative. Every line converges upward. All structural forces are directed to that single point. The entire geometry is focused there. Historically, we know the pyramid was once capped with a special stone, a pyramidion, often coated in a material that reflects light extremely well. In a system where energy moves upward, the apex is the natural release point. If you step back and look at the whole picture, a system that gathers flow, amplifies it, transforms it inside the structure, and then channels energy upward, what does that resemble? A power plant. Now, I'm not saying this was a power plant in the modern sense. No wires, no turbines, no familiar infrastructure. But strip away what we usually picture and focus on the core principle, and the resemblance becomes hard to ignore. Any power system has the same basic stages: a source of energy, amplification or storage, conversion, output. Now map that onto Giza. Source: flowing water. Amplification: the complex geometry of channels and elevation differences. Conversion: vibration and resonance inside the structure. Output: the apex of the pyramid. In modern energy systems, resonance is often used to amplify signals without significantly increasing energy input. We've already seen that same principle inside the pyramid, repeating pulses reinforcing each other. Connect all these elements and you get a surprisingly coherent picture. And now we come back to the three pyramids, but this time we see them differently. Not as three similar monuments, but as components with distinct roles inside a larger system. The Great Pyramid is the largest, the most structurally complex. It contains granite chambers at key points. From an engineering perspective, it looks like the core unit, the place where the main energy transformation happens. The Pyramid of Khafre sits higher due to the terrain and has steeper faces. A steeper angle affects how forces are distributed. Greater elevation changes potential differences. In system terms, this structure could serve as an amplifier or stabilizer. It may not generate energy itself, but it helps the system stay balanced. The Pyramid of Menkaure is smaller, but more intricate inside, with partial granite casing. If the first is the core, and the second stabilizes the system, the third might handle final processing or closure of the loop. The pattern of differences is too precise to ignore. If these were just tombs, each ruler would build for themselves, bigger, richer, more impressive. That's not what we see here. We see three structures that differ exactly where those differences would matter for a unified function. That doesn't happen by accident. And there's another key point. For a system like this to work, every component has to operate in sync with the others. This isn't a collection of independent structures. It's a single chain. Change one parameter and the whole system breaks. That's exactly what we saw in John Cadman's experiment. Even the smallest deviation in geometry and the pulses disappeared. That's not how random structures behave. That's how engineered systems behave. This doesn't look like the same design repeated at different scales. It looks like a coordinated configuration where each pyramid complements the others. There's a flow. There's a system that directs it. There are materials that respond to stress. And there are 3 structures, each playing a role. But storing or transforming energy inside the structure is only half the equation. It still has to go somewhere. If this system really generated energy, how was it transmitted? There's no evidence of wires, cables, or anything resembling familiar infrastructure, which leaves 2 options. Either the energy wasn't transmitted at all, or it was transmitted in a completely different way. And this is where an idea comes in that's been around for over a century. Energy doesn't have to travel through wires. It can move through space via oscillations at specific frequencies. If a source and a receiver are tuned to the same frequency, energy can transfer between them without direct contact. It sounds unusual, but the principle itself is well understood. And this is where a comparison shows up that might feel like a stretch at first, but hear it out. This is where Nikola Tesla enters the picture. Tesla worked on exactly this, wireless transmission of energy over long distances. His experiments were built around resonance. One system generates oscillations. Another system, tuned to the same frequency, receives them. If the pyramids really operated using resonance, then in theory, they could have performed a similar function.
I'm not saying the ancient Egyptians built a Tesla machine, but the underlying principle, using resonance to transfer energy, no longer seems impossible. Tesla believed that the Earth itself could act as both a conductor and a resonator. He tried to use it as a global transmission medium, designing a system where energy could be sent to any point on the planet. His Wardenclyffe Tower was never completed, but the idea itself, using the Earth as the medium, was something he took very seriously. If the pyramids were operating on similar physical principles, the parallel becomes even more intriguing. And here's a key point. If energy is transmitted through space, the system has to be precisely tuned. Even the slightest deviation and the transmission stops working. Which brings us right back to that same precision we talked about earlier. Millimeters that matter. If such a system ever existed, it would have required extremely precise calibration. Over time, any structure settles, materials shift, geometry degrades. Which means either the system was built with an enormous margin of precision, or it was maintained. And either scenario suggests a level of physical understanding we don't usually associate with ancient Egypt. Now, I'm going to pause here deliberately, because beyond this point, it's very easy to drift into speculation. So let's draw a clear line between what we know and what remains hypothetical. What is supported? There was water. The geometry works when replicated precisely, shown in John Cadman's experiment. Granite with quartz responds to vibration. That's basic physics. The plateau can transmit oscillations. Everything else is a logical extension, but still unproven. And one final question. What would allow a system like this to run continuously, not just once? The answer, again, points back to water. Water flows in, builds pressure, triggers pulses, and as long as the source remains stable, the system could, in theory, keep running. That's why the Khufu branch near the plateau matters so much, not just as a transport route, but as a constant input for the entire mechanism.
The pyramids have been standing for 4,000 years. We scanned them with muon tomography and discovered hidden voids we didn't even know existed. We read the work logs of the builders. We analyze soil samples and reconstruct the climate of their time. And even with all that, we still don't fully understand them. So what are we looking at? A monument? Or a piece of technology? Because right now, they look a lot like a forgotten machine. Look at everything we've covered. A hydraulic engineer walks into the pyramid and sees a pump system. Another engineer builds a model and finds it only works when the geometry is exact. Geologists find evidence of water where today there's only desert. Researchers reconstruct a river right at the base of the plateau. Physicists point to materials that respond to vibration, exactly the way this system would require. They all worked in completely different fields, independently. And they all ended up seeing the same thing.
Let's be clear, this is not proof. No one has reproduced the entire chain at full scale. John Cadman showed that the principle works in a model. But from water pulses all the way to energy output at the top, that's still a reconstruction, not a documented fact. That matters. And still, why haul granite from 800 kilometers away when there's plenty of other stone nearby? Why achieve a level of precision where a millimeter changes how the system behaves? Why choose this exact location, with a river at its base, with predictable annual floods, with a plateau that transmits vibration? For a tomb, none of that is necessary. Not a single part of it. They stand there like a forgotten machine. Not broken, forgotten. The geometry is intact. The materials are still there. The proportions haven't changed. 4,000 years, and the base deviates by less than 2 centimeters. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. So if this really was a machine, who built it? And why did it stop?